Hi everyone, my name is Lauren Model and I'm the Teaching and Learning Manager for the Scholars Program, and welcome to this session designed to prepare you to deliver one of our pre-designed courses on the Scholars Program. I'm joined in this session by my colleague Phoebe, who will share a range of strategies to support younger pupils to access and engage in our pre-designed courses. I'll now turn things over to her to introduce herself and get the session started.
Thanks, Lauren. My name's Phoebe and I'm one of the managers on the Brilliant Tutoring Programme. And before I joined the Brilliant Club, I worked as a primary school teacher. So the purpose of this session will be firstly to identify your pre-designed course's key outcomes and learning content. We'll then look at your pre-designed course's final assignment and think about how it links to the rest of the course. And finally, we'll be exploring some of the different strategies and techniques which can be used to engage younger pupils. In order to get the most out of this session, it's really important that you have a PDF copy of your pre-designed course in front of you. I would also recommend having a paper and pen or somewhere that you can note down ideas and planning during the session. So to start off with, we're going to have a look at your handbook content. So what I'm going to ask you to do in a moment is to pause this video and spend a little bit of time looking through the handbook. You might have already started to do this. And what I'd like you to do is to jot down some ideas under these three following sections. So firstly, anything you see within the handbook which you like or you're excited by. Secondly, any challenges that you see, anything that you think might be a bit more difficult to teach or deliver during tutorials. And finally, any additional resources that you think you would need to create in order to make tutorials really effective.
Thanks, Phoebe. Now that you've had a chance to quickly look through your course, we'll take a step back and explore the bigger picture to identify the main aims of your course and identify what your pupils will need to learn and be able to do by the end of the course. So let's start by reading through the course rationale, the mark scheme, and the final assignment, and note down your answers to the following questions on the slide. Firstly, state the aim of the course in one sentence. What would you summarize this course as being about? Then, what do you think the three main outcomes should be for pupils? In other words, what knowledge and academic skills will pupils have developed by the end of the course? Go ahead and pause the video now to do this. What you've just done here is the first step in backwards planning. Backwards planning, as you may be aware, is when you begin by identifying the end point of your course or learning experience. In this case, by spending some time defining the aims of the course, understanding the final assignment, and the main outcomes for pupils. As PhD researchers, you're used to thinking like this. For example, you begin with a hypothesis or a research question, and then think about how you can begin to answer this question. You'll think about questions like, what do we need to know? How are we going to go about getting this information? What resources might I need? And do I need to broaden my knowledge base before I can get to the heart of a research question? Similarly, if you were to build a skyscraper, you wouldn't start by gathering the electricians, landscapers, builders, and interior designers all at once. You'd start with an end goal and determine what steps you need to take to reach this. Backwards planning is an important strategy to keep in mind as you plan to deliver your pre-designed program and for each tutorial. So now that you've defined these main outcomes for your course, you should bear them in mind when planning your tutorials. Try to ask yourself how tutorials are working towards these aims and outcomes. Remember that you may not be able to get pupils all the way to these exact aims and outcomes, but by knowing what you are aiming for at the beginning, you will find it much easier to help pupils progress towards that endpoint. This activity asks you to start by looking at the final assignment and identifying the key academic skills and content or subject knowledge that pupils will need in order to complete it. When you have identified these, write them in the first and third column on the worksheet, which you can also download below this video. Once you've done this, look at your baseline assignment in Tutorial 1 and identify where you can assess pupils' current level of skill or knowledge of content in the baseline assignment. Write this down into column 2 and 4. This will help you better use the baseline to check where pupils are currently at in terms of their subject knowledge and academic skills, and then to adapt your delivery to provide additional support or challenge as needed. Pause the video now to complete this task. Now that we've identified the main aims of your course and how the baseline and final assignments support pupil progress towards these outcomes, we'll turn to thinking about planning for your tutorials. For lots of you, this diagram below may look familiar, and you may already be confident with planning tutorials because you've had the chance to deliver your own Scholars Program course. However, because the pre-designed course you're delivering now is less familiar, I think it's really important for us to revisit these 3 core principles and to apply them to the course that you'll be delivering. So firstly, we have planning, thinking about what students need to know, what subject knowledge they need to gain by the end of the tutorial. And if you find that you're running short on time or that pupils are struggling with particular concepts, what content could you miss out of the pre-designed course if necessary? Secondly, we have progress, thinking about when you will need to check that pupils have understood key concepts or ideas and how you will go about checking for this understanding. And finally, we have participation, which is something that's especially important when working with younger pupils. So we'll be thinking about what students will be doing, but also how you will make sure that pupils are participating in the tutorial effectively. On the screen, you will see a session planning template that you can also download below this video. As mentioned previously, we suggest you use the framework of backwards planning to plan for each tutorial. Since we need to know what knowledge and skills pupils should end the tutorial with, you should begin by planning the objectives. What do you want pupils to get out of the tutorial? Do they help them progress towards the final assignment? The tutorial objectives will help you adapt tutorials to suit pupils' needs while still ensuring that they are prepared for the final assignment. Once you have a clear sense of where pupils need to end their learning journey in this tutorial, it's now time to plan out how they get there. With this in mind, it is then important to ensure that there is a link between the tutorial objectives and the activities in the tutorial. Completing the activities should support students in achieving the objectives, and completing the plenary activity should demonstrate that they have met the objective. A plenary will also help you to know how or where you can skip activities if you find pupils need further support. Over the next slides, we will look at each part of the tutorial planning structure in more detail. The purpose of a starter is to engage students in the topic of that tutorial or check what they have remembered from last week's tutorial. If they haven't retained the information from last week, it makes sense to review last week's learning, particularly if the next tutorial requires a foundation of knowledge taught in the previous tutorial. The learning activities are the direct instruction component of the tutorial. You should consider how best to convey the key information from the tutorial and consider how to encourage students to actively participate and engage with this topic. This should be shorter than the main activity component of the tutorial. Main activities should form the core component of the tutorial. Students should have already demonstrated an initial grasp of the core content of the tutorial and are now furthering their knowledge, engaging actively in the content, and thinking about the subject more critically. The role of you as the tutor in this section of the tutorial should be supporting students to engage with this knowledge rather than explicitly instructing or lecturing pupils. The plenary should allow you to determine whether the aims of the tutorials have been fully met and whether students are ready to progress to the next tutorial. This could involve questioning, a short written activity, or a problem question. If you Google 100 ideas for plenaries, the University of Southampton have provided an extensive list of suggestions. While the course aims and assignments in pre-designed programs are set, you can and should feel as though you can adapt the content and activities in each tutorial to suit your pupils using the 3 principles outlined again here on the slide. Before you start to think about the pre-designed course you'll be delivering, let's take a look at how tutors have adapted tutorial plans in the past. Our first example is one of our Arts and Humanities pre-designed courses entitled Inside Number 10, which explores the role of Prime Minister. As you can see from the slide, in the planning phase, the tutor has identified some important things to keep in mind. They've begun by identifying where they will absolutely need to ensure that pupils have understood using a hinge point question. They've identified that on page 13, they need to check that pupils understand who represents them in Parliament before the learning can move forward. They've also planned for what activities could be removed or condensed if it appears that pupils are struggling with some core concepts, like who represents them in Parliament. They've also identified what content must be covered in order to meet the learning outcomes that they identified. In this tutorial, the tutor would prioritize the content on page 13, as they've indicated this is central to learning outcomes and would be challenging for pupils to cover at home alone, but recognize that they can move more quickly through or skip altogether activities on page 14 and page 17. The next example is one of our STEM programs entitled The Healthy Heart, where pupils learn about the circulatory system and design their own scientific experiment. Similarly, as with the Arts and Humanities tutor, this tutor has identified where they will need to check that pupils definitely understand a core concept before moving forward. In this case, which type of blood vessel is most likely to carry deoxygenated blood. As in the example before, they've identified what could be removed or shortened in the tutorial if pupils are struggling with this core concept. And they've also identified which content must be covered in order to meet the learning outcomes. In this case, pages 9 and 10 in this course handbook would be vital to cover with pupils because it would be difficult for them to cover on their own at home, and also are vital to obtaining the aims of the tutorial. Now that we've had a chance to look at these principles and how they can be used to plan tutorials, I'll shortly ask you to pause the video to plan one of your tutorials in more detail. You can also use the session planning template available below this video to put together your plan. When you're ready to continue, unpause the video again, and Phoebe will share and discuss some strategies, activities, and general guidance to engage younger pupils in your tutorials.
So moving on, we're now going to spend some time looking in a bit more detail at working with pupils in Key Stage 2 and 3 and thinking about some of the strategies that can be implemented to make sure that you get the most out of your sessions, that the students get the most out of sessions, and that they are really engaged throughout the tutorials. So I think when people think about working with Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3 students, some specific challenges in particular often come into mind, and these are things like being able to pitch tutorials appropriately and worrying that the pitch will be too high for them. Also worries around behaviour management and being concerned that that could be quite challenging to deal with. And then thirdly, being able to keep students engaged. Obviously they're a little bit younger, that emotional maturity is lacking a little bit more, and so that is something that some of our tutors flag as an area that they're worried about ahead of working with Key Stage 2 and 3 students. So firstly, I'd just like to address the top two of these challenges in particular. So thinking about pitch being appropriate, this is one of the main reasons that we do use specifically designed pre-designed courses which have been created with education partners in order to make sure that that pitch is appropriate. On top of this, some of the content that we looked at in the previous section of today's training around the 3 Ps of planning and around thinking about that final assignment will also help to make sure that the pitch is appropriate. So hopefully at the end of this session, you will all feel much more confident and certain that the pitch of your course will be absolutely fine for the students that you're going to work with. And then secondly, behaviour management I know is something that some of our tutors worry about. Firstly, just to flag that this is really unlikely to be an issue when you're working with groups of this size. So usually, obviously, you'll be working with groups of 6 students. So that number is still really, really manageable, even if the students are in year 5 or 6 or 7. It's much easier to be able to communicate really clearly with a group of younger students that size. I'd say the main bit of advice I would also give in terms of behaviour management, and to make sure that it definitely won't be a problem, is to set out your expectations really clearly and very early on. So a way that you can do this is to set some expectations with the students, make sure they're really positive. So rather than saying we will not, saying we will. So for example, we will take it in turns to speak, and so on. And if you write these down and you kind of display them within the room, or you maybe have them on a PowerPoint and you refer back to them regularly, then this will really make sure that students understand your expectations and create a really positive working environment. As well as this, with Key Stage 2 and 3 students, as well as with older students, remember that lots of praise and positive reinforcement goes a really long way. Students really enjoy feeling like, you know, someone's proud of them and someone's impressed. So I would say definitely focus on the positives, focus on lots of praise, set those expectations early on, and you'll absolutely love working with this age group. What I'd like to do now is spend a little bit more time looking in particular at any of the challenges that you flagged and thinking about how you might be able to address these or take steps to overcome them. So what I'm going to ask you to do in a moment is to pause the video again and to look in particular at the challenges that you flagged, and to start coming up with a couple of ideas for ways that you can address these. And I've put a couple of examples for you on the right to refer back to. So looking at the first one, you might have flagged, for example, that you think there is quite a bit of challenging vocab within the handbook for students to learn and to understand. So you might want to come up with some starter activities or plenary activities that you can use as mini checks for this vocab. So they could be in the form of a game, in the form of a matching activity, or anything else that you might want to do to act as a checking of understanding. And there's a couple of other examples on the right there for you to have a look at as well. So we're now going to focus on that third challenge, which some of our tutors flag as something they're a bit more concerned about, around engaging Key Stage 2 and 3 pupils. So the following slides will contain some really practical and applicable strategies that you can hopefully use within tutorials, and I will just briefly talk through each one as well. So the first one is hot seating, and this involves an individual, so it could be you as the tutor, or it could be one of your students, sitting on a specific chair and taking on the role of a certain character. So it's almost a kind of role play, and the idea is that the fellow students, or you as the tutor, then ask that individual specific questions with them in role. So this could be used in lots of different settings. It could be that the person sitting in the chair is a policy maker, for example. It could be that they're a politician. It could be that they are a scientist looking at something specific, or it could be that they are a literary character, for example. So it's not really about the acting element, it's much more about seeing first of all what questions the rest of the group can ask this person, and also what kind of answers the person sitting in the chair can give. And it's a really great way to assess understanding, it's a great way to develop students' speaking and listening skills, and it can also be a great way to just introduce a topic or develop the student's confidence as well. So next up we have the idea of a lesson hook. So this is usually an image or a video that's quite eye-catching or thought-provoking, which can be used to introduce a new topic or a learning objective of a session, or for example used as the stimulus for a specific discussion. So the idea of hooks is that they help engage pupils in a subject that they're quite familiar with. It can also help them develop deeper understanding. If it's something, for example, you looked at in a previous tutorial, you could introduce the next tutorial with a hook which might challenge their understanding from the previous week, or which might encourage them to develop their thinking further. Hooks can also be used to determine the level of prior knowledge and understanding of a new topic, so they could be a great way to introduce your concepts or a new topic within the first tutorial. And if you want any more ideas about really specific lesson hooks, if you just Google the idea of a lesson hook, it will give you lots of different ideas, but I would say in particular very eye-catching images, media clips, sound bites, or even, it could just be a word or a phrase, so that when students come into your tutorial, you can set them something really specific or ask them something to do with the hook and generate that engagement from there. I know some tutors as well worry about being able to generate really rich debates with younger students, and I think a way that you can make sure that this happens is by displaying sentence starters for the students to refer to. So again, these could just be written on a whiteboard in the classroom, they could be as part of your PowerPoint, or you could even put them into the handbook for students to refer back to. And what I would do then is make sure that students use these as much as possible within the discussion and kind of really reinforce that with positive praise for students who do. So for example, if you're having a discussion, you might want to split students into two different sides of an argument and encourage them to use these sentence starters to encourage that debate and that challenging of ideas as well. Another one that I really like is something we call voting with your feet, and this works really well to get students up and moving at Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3 level. So the idea is, rather than asking students their opinion and asking them to verbalise that kind of on the spot, you have some pieces of paper with different opinions on, for example, strongly agree, strongly disagree, unsure, somewhat agree, and so on. So anything that you kind of choose, and these can literally just be written on a piece of A4 paper. And the idea is that you put these up around the room, so either on the floor or you could just blue tack them up on the wall in the classroom you're using. Pose a question to the students, make sure you give them lots of thinking time, and then ask them to go and stand by the piece of paper which most accurately reflects their views. The reason that this is really effective is, like I said, it gets students up and moving and it breaks up the tutorial. It also encourages all students within the group to contribute. So I think something that I like to really emphasise to tutors is that not all contributions from students have to be verbal and individual. Students are still contributing if they are contributing silently, and they are contributing by voting with their feet rather than by articulating their opinion necessarily. Similarly, it's less intimidating for those students who might be less confident because their decision is being made within a group. So there might be others within the group who feel the same as them, and therefore it kind of makes it feel a bit more supportive. This can also lead really nicely to a discussion. So once the students have stood in their various different places in terms of how much they agree or disagree, you can then cold call students, again make sure you give them plenty of thinking time, and ask them if they are happy to expand on their views. For example, why have you decided that you strongly agree? Can you explain your decision to the rest of the group? To someone else, you've disagreed, can you explain why you disagree? And so on. So it's a really nice way to generate discussion and to get students up and moving. So this technique is called a boxed up plan and was devised by someone called Pi Corbett, who I'd really recommend you to Google and look at more resources for this kind of age group. Essentially, the idea of this is kind of boxing up ideas, so it could be used as a way to plan students' final assignments, so boxing up various different sections of the assignment, such as introduction, paragraph 1, counter-argument, and so on. Or it could be used to plan for a debate, so the opening point, counterpoint, and so on. There's lots of different ways that you could incorporate boxed up plans into your tutorials. A lot of students will also be familiar with this approach because they are likely to have seen it within their school lessons as well. So it's something that students feel quite comfortable to do. Finally, I think it's really important as a tutor to have some really specific sentence starters that you can use when responding to your students if they've given you an answer to a question or expressed an idea. These sentence starters will help encourage students to explain their thinking really specifically and can also be used to challenge the thinking of those students who might be more confident. It could be that they're explaining something to you. It could also be that you ask students to use these sentence starters with each other, explaining to a partner. It also could be that you use one of these sentence starters as the basis for a homework, a starter, or as a plenary activity. Moving on, I'm now going to outline a couple of quick assessment techniques which can be used with Key Stage 2 and 3 pupils to assess their understanding and to really quickly get a picture within the class of how everyone's feeling about the content. So firstly, a technique which especially primary school students will be really familiar with is 2 stars and a wish, or something which Key Stage 3 students will use as well, is what went well and even better if. That's the WWW and EBI. And the idea of these is that you either ask students to do them. So for example, at the end of a tutorial using post-it notes, you ask them to give 2 positives from the tutorial, 2 things that they might have learnt, 2 things that they feel really confident in, and 1 wish or 1 even better if. So for example, next week it would be great to cover X topic again, or I'm still feeling a little bit unsure about this. So they can be used as a really quick assessment. Again, these could be teacher assessments, they could be self-assessments, so students are doing it themselves, or they could be peer assessments, so students giving feedback to each other on a piece of work that they've done within the course. They can also be verbal, so it can be that they are just said to each other, or they can be written as well. Similarly, the thumbs up technique is one which I think actually works really well with students of all ages, and it's really simply you might have covered a topic, introduced a new piece of vocab, or finished a tutorial, and you are asking students to show to you with their thumb how confident they're feeling with the topic. So thumbs up if they're feeling really confident with it, thumb in the middle if they think they're nearly there but they need a little bit more support or practice, and thumb down if they are really unsure. And again, it's up to you how you then move forward with this knowledge. It might be that you do this as a quick check halfway through a tutorial, and then you adapt your teaching based on the result of the students with the assessment. Or it might be that a student in particular is thumbs down and you can speak to them maybe over the VLE or send them some additional resources on the VLE or at the end of a tutorial in order to support them with their learning. Starters and plenaries can also be really effective ways to assess students' understanding and check where they're up to. So I've kind of split these into 3 categories. So the top 2 are slightly sillier starter and plenary activities, but can be quite fun for students to do. So for example, asking them to explain a concept or write down their explanation of a concept, but give them a really specific number of words that they have to do it in. There are other more functional starter or plenary activities that you might want to do, and these are quite good as kind of fact finding exercises, so that you can really quickly see whether students have grasped a new concept or a definition. So things like filling the gaps or matching words with their key definitions. And then other more practical starter or plenary activities can be used. So these are things that you can just ask students to get on with when they enter your tutorial, or they might be things that you ask them to complete before they leave. Things like writing down some new information that they've learnt on a post-it note, or asking them as they come in something that they learnt or remember from last week's tutorial, or for example giving them a really short passage of writing and giving them the mark scheme or asking them to mark that short passage of writing. Again, encourages students to really engage with the course content, but also helps to vary the learning and keep them really interested. Finally, some of my top tips for working with younger pupils aged 9 to 13. So hopefully throughout this training session, I've given you lots of ideas of ways that you can involve your students, and I think that's something that is really important to bear in mind with Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3. They will learn more, they will be more engaged, and they will really enjoy your sessions as well if they feel that they are being involved rather than kind of just talked at. Secondly, like I said earlier, with the positive praise and reinforcement, make sure that you're giving students the chance to shine. So this might be through an activity like hot seating, it might be through a task like a debate or a discussion, or it might be that you celebrate students' work at the start or the end of tutorials in different ways. Thirdly, Thirdly, I think really linked to that first point is make sure that learning is fun. I think this is something which definitely applies to learning at all ages, but even more so at Key Stage 2 and 3. Students might start the course feeling quite intimidated or feeling worried that this is going to be something quite hard, and I think showing them that actually it's going to be really fun and enjoyable will help students to feel really comfortable and confident during the course. Stepping away from the textbook, so I think this doesn't mean don't refer to theory or bring in readings. That's definitely still really important, and we still want students to have that university style experience, but equally it's sometimes making sure that you are applying the learning to their own lives, so making sure that it feels really contextualized for them, and also using different resources to keep them engaged. I think this one is really, really important and comes hand in hand with setting clear expectations, is making sure that you give really clear instructions and make sure that students have time limits and understand what you're asking them to do. I think modelling everything first is something that you probably already do when you've done tutorials with older students, but really make sure that you are doing that with Key Stage 2 or 3 students, showing how you would do it first and then giving them the chance to do it themselves. Having those learning objectives is always really important, but making sure that students can see them and that you refer back to them throughout the session will mean that they come away from each tutorial really confident that they have learned something new and that they're gaining new knowledge in preparation for that final assignment. The next one that we've kind of covered quite a lot is making sure that you are keeping students moving and varying the dynamics. So maybe with older students, when you're doing a debate, it might be absolutely fine for them to kind of keep sitting where they are and to start from that point. But I think with younger students, really supporting that by structuring it. You might physically ask students to move and sit in certain groups for a debate. It might be like we talked about earlier, you get them to start off by voting with their feet and then ask them to kind of change sides. You might want to give them specific roles or viewpoints within a debate in order to make sure it's really structured and varied in terms of those social dynamics. Next up, which is really similar, is using different materials, and I think this links really nicely to point 4 about stepping away from the textbooks. The handbooks have lots of different types of materials in, and like I said earlier in the session, you might have your own ideas as well, so definitely don't be afraid to think about how you can bring in different materials within the pre-design course. Next up, like I said earlier, make sure that you're really thinking about praise. When you're working with older students or at university level, you might find it really important that you correct students if they phrase something slightly wrong, or you make sure they're using the correct terminology. Whilst it's still important to have really high expectations of students at any age, really try and focus on the positives, and that will help to instill a lot of confidence in slightly younger students and set them in a really good position ahead of their final assignment. And finally, hopefully I've really made sure this comes across during the session. We're really keen that you make this course your own, even though you didn't design it yourself, and we really, really hope that you enjoy yourself. I think while sometimes some of our tutors can be a little bit more worried about working with slightly younger students, all of our tutors who deliver courses at Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3 come away expressing how much they've enjoyed it and how much they actually really like working with slightly younger students and seeing how much they progress and grow in confidence over the course of the tutorials.
Thanks, Phoebe. That brings us to the end of this session, and we hope you're looking forward to working through your pre-design course with pupils. Please ensure you complete the exit quiz for this session and the rest of your training as outlined in the guidance document shared with you by your program officer. We hope you enjoy working with your pupils soon.